Thank you to Blinkist for supporting PBS. In the last episode, we traced some of the major influences of werewolf legends back thousands of years in Europe, and looked at how Christianity and real-world tragedies positioned the wolf shapeshifter as a demonic threat, fears that ultimately culminated in the torture and execution of humans rumored to be werewolves. There's usually a fine line between fact and fiction when it comes to monsters. So when did the threat of werewolves become something largely resigned to the pages of fiction? During the industrialization, urbanization, and rapid scientific advancement of the 19th century, the werewolf was increasingly positioned as literary fantasy rather than a real threat. The werewolf slunk back into antiquity, a symbol of the past. But modern literature and the silver screen reinvigorated the werewolf legend. Most contemporary ideas and conceptions of the werewolf became dominated and driven by film, and they still are. We've moved the werewolf from the realms of mythology, from tales of warriors and witches, to a pop culture icon. I'm Dr. Emily Zarka, and this is Monstrum. Given the large scope of the folklore collection of Brothers Grimm, it's not surprising that their 1812 anthology of German folklore includes the story of a man who transforms into a werewolf using a special belt. Variations of the story became the most common werewolf story in Germany at the time. The popularity of the Grimm brothers' publications helped launch the werewolf into mainstream literature. The first werewolf in a 19th century novel appears around the time of the Grimm tales too, in an 1824 historical romance titled The Albigensis. Written by Irish Gothic novelist Charles Robert Maturin and set in the 13th century, a character within the text wakes from a nightmare to find himself under attack by a lycanthrope with fiery eyes, white fangs, and claws, who is in a horrid frenzy. Later, the attacker confesses, "I am a fangless wolf, a wolfman," although he says his fur grows on the inside. The Gothic genre continued to evolve alongside and influence the pulpy penny dreadfuls, cheap volumes of weekly serialized sensational and violent stories, the perfect place for the first savage werewolf transformation. First serialized as a penny dreadful and published as a collected text in 1847, Wagner the Werewolf is often considered the first English text to have a werewolf as its main character. Set in Germany, it opens with a mysterious man offering the elderly Wagner the chance to be young and handsome again, to have great fortunes and intelligence to rival his riches. But there are two conditions. The old man must be the stranger's companion for a year and a half, and he must prey upon the human race as a werewolf. Wagner accepts the offering and drinks the contents of a small vial the stranger provides him. He loses consciousness, but upon waking, the old man is not only young, but preternaturally healthy and intelligent. It is later revealed that the deal he made was with John Faust, and Wagner is now immortal, but must turn into a werewolf once a month. And the description of that change is intense. Convulsing horribly and shrieking, Wagner's body elongates from its human form into one of savage and brute-like shape. His beautiful clothes become rough, shaggy, and wiry skin, and with a howl of misery, he becomes a monstrous wolf. After the mid-19th century, werewolf accounts in literature were often presented as some kind of backward or strange local value of the lower class, and the creatures were dismissed by rational explanation. An example of this is found in the first academic study of werewolves in the English language, Sabine Baring-Gould's 1865 Book of Werewolves, Account of a Terrible Superstition. The Anglican priest's folklore collection claimed that while werewolf legends were present across all nations, they could all be explained as real cases of human violence that inspired monstrous behavior, usually cannibalism brought on by madness. The book did collect werewolf tales from a variety of historical and folkloric sources, serving as a werewolf anthology of sorts. And while science and religion continued to try to explain away these stories, people's appetite for salaciousness and escapism wasn't going anywhere. The creature's variations inspired fresh narratives, like the introduction of the seductive female werewolf. In the late 19th century, stories of female werewolves with white fur appeared. The attacks of these white she-wolves correspond to the sudden appearance of a beautiful young stranger. This woman's real werewolf identity is often indicated when in her human form by her unusual eyes and penchant for wearing white fur. Many stories, like The White Wolf of Kostopshin, The Werewolf, and The Other Side, solidified the presence of the female werewolf in horror, another beautiful and sexually threatening creature, contributing to the already established role of supernaturally monstrous women in Gothic literature. At the turn of the century, mostly as a result of increased attention towards psychology, werewolves became more associated with the idea of a beast within, a hidden illness or monstrous personality concealed by a veneer of civility. They also reverted back to being almost exclusively male. The reason for this is the more frequent depiction of female victims, starting with Richard Baggett's novel A Roman Mystery in 1899, which detailed a male werewolf's lurid attack on his sister-in-law. The helpless woman attacked by the sexually aggressive Wolfman proved to be a popular take in penny dreadfuls, pulp magazines, and novels, and eventually film. I talked with horror critic and journalist Meagan Navarro to learn more about how the werewolf's legacy was shaped by the movies.
Movies definitely changed the werewolf in popular imagination, but werewolf legends from centuries ago were often based around serial killers that terrorized the land. The Beast of Verdun or the Werewolf of Dole. These were based on men that were serial killers and slaughtered, and folklore was a means of exploring and understanding those acts by transforming them into literal monsters. Movie depictions internalized that. It put the murderer and the unwitting accomplice into one body fighting for control in a way. It made that all about an internal battle. So it has an inherently tragic nature about that.
Even with the thousands of years of European lore to draw from, the first werewolf movies instead appropriated and bastardized the legends of the indigenous peoples of North America. The first motion picture to feature a werewolf is the 1913 silent film The Werewolf. We only know about cinema's first werewolf from movie reviews and historical documents. The film was destroyed by a massive fire at Universal Studios in 1924. In the film, a Dene woman marries a white man. After he is killed, she is led to believe he abandoned her, and in anger, she becomes a witch and raises their daughter to hate white men. The daughter grows up and leads a revolt against a group of friars for safeguarding the jealous white man who killed her lover. During the confrontation, she turns into a wolf after being shown a crucifix. The following year in 1914, the white wolf again borrowed from a skewed perception of indigenous legend. The film portrays another scorned lover, this time an indigenous medicine man who demands the hand of a woman who does not return his affections. With the help of her lover, the medicine man is caught in his wolf form and transforms back into a human. Alas, we don't know exactly how the transformation is depicted, since this film too has been lost to time. Both films clearly demonize non-white populations, a theme that permeated many American horror films of the early 20th century. These horror and werewolf films were made in the shadow of federal policies that persecuted indigenous populations, including the seizing of their native lands and the establishment of mandatory Christian boarding schools. The earliest surviving werewolf film is Wolf Blood. Released in 1925, it is the first known depiction of a white werewolf in North America on screen, although it is left to the audience to decide if he really is a wolf shapeshifter or suffering from clinical lycanthropy. In it, a man living in a remote logging camp receives a life-saving blood transfusion from a tame female wolf. After the successful procedure, rival loggers are killed in a wolf attack, and rumors begin to swirl that the lupine blood in the man's veins transformed him into a werewolf. Distraught by the accusation and haunted by dreams of running with a pack of wolves, the man tries to kill himself. Other early 20th century films contribute significantly to the modern werewolf canon: The Werewolf of London, which is the first on-screen depiction of a werewolf's bite transforming another human into a werewolf. The Werewolf of London is Universal Studios' first foray into werewolf films. In the movie, East Asia is the source of the werewolf curse. The main character, botanist Dr. Glendon, is bitten in Tibet by a werewolf while collecting a rare flower under the full moon. Ironically, he is told by fellow botanist Dr. Yogami, played by a Scottish actor in Yellowface, who tells Dr. Glendon that the flower is the only thing that can cure his werewolf curse. Glendon rampages through London in wolf form and discovers that Yogami is the werewolf that bit him, and the two werewolves fight. Glendon prevails, but survives only long enough to be shot by Scotland Yard and transform back into his human body as he takes his final breath. 1935 lacked the special effects technology to turn an actor into a realistic-looking wolf, so the Werewolf of London created a hybrid man-wolf monster with predominantly human features, although much hairier. Scholars read this film as a representation of repressed homosexuality, a warning against the potential dangers of scientific advancement, the uncontrolled spread of infectious disease, and the growing fear of the East Asian population in the Western world. The film hit theaters the same week as Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff films, and The Werewolf of London was quickly overshadowed by the already popular monsters, a vampire and Frankenstein's creature. But luckily, Universal didn't give up on the werewolf genre quite yet. A few years later, Universal introduced the Wolfman in a series of films, leading to another werewolf surge. In part because the journey of the titular Wolfman across Europe paralleled the movement of Allied soldiers in World War II. Dr. Kaja Franck, who I also talked to in the first episode, had this to say about the Wolfman film.
Now, the plot of The Wolfman from 1941 is particularly interesting to me because of the traits and the tropes that it brings about that still retain today in how we understand the modern idea of the werewolf. So we start with Lon Chaney Jr., a rather hapless American coming over to Wales in order to inherit his family seat.
Oh, I remember you. That night, and in the crypt.
Go inside.
Travelling characters recur again and again as vehicles of the supernatural, whether that's because they have a certain amount of knowledge that the rational Western mind does not have, or whether that's because they themselves are infected or monstrous in some way. Now, it's particular that I use the term infected because a transformation is due to a bite, and of course we now understand that werewolves transform because you get bitten and then you get infected and then you become a werewolf. And sure enough, we have Lon Chaney Jr. transforming at a full moon, which again is a real trope that we see in werewolves today. But also not just that, not being aware of what he's done. Now, although he isn't killed by a silver bullet, he's beaten to death by his father, as it happens. There is an element of tragedy there. They simply can't control what they are doing. And so, again, when we look at texts nowadays, although the death of the beast, the destruction of the violent animalistic trait, the violent animalistic monster is necessary, it's not always met with absolute happiness. There is a question of whether we ourselves could find ourselves guilty of things that we're not aware that we're doing.
The release of the first of these films in 1941 featured the more enduring, human-looking werewolf interpretation.
They were likable characters that became the villains in their own stories through often no fault of their own. That set them apart. It was a transformation of successful people to varying degrees, unraveling thanks to unwanted and terrifying changes in their own body. That makes them more relatable than your average movie monster. And then on top of that, you have remarkable makeup effects in both cases of the Werewolf of London and the Wolfman. Jack Pierce did both of those makeups, and it brought that internal battle, that loss of control, to the forefront. It crystallized the tragic horror. It gave it a visual, like a more textual approach through seeing that transformation.
In history, real monsters appropriate the ones we talk about here. After World War I, soldiers in the German military, who refused to disband at the end of the war, joined together under the moniker Werewolf. The unit would go on to become an elite Nazi recruiting source in World War II. Werewolves were consciously integrated into the Nazi Party, borrowing from older German myths to create propaganda that reflected Hitler's notorious obsession with the supernatural and the occult. He even used wolf as a pseudonym for himself. As World War II came to an end, the Nazis launched multiple campaigns inspired by the lupine beast. In 1944, they developed Operation Werewolf, a mass poisoning plot that was never successfully implemented, although declassified documents from the National Archives in Britain show that the supplies of American and British troops were targeted. Then, in 1945, a werewolf forces unit was created with the intent of putting volunteer German fighters secretly behind enemy lines. These Nazi werewolf operations would not be examined in fiction until much later. The real and lasting effect of the horrors of the Nazi regime made that impossible. With the end of the war and the new atomic era, a timely werewolf appeared, the scientifically created nuclear experiment werewolf. In 1956, moviegoers were introduced to the human-to-wolf transformation caused by irradiated wolf blood in The Werewolf, adding nuclear experimentation into the werewolf canon. Other anxieties of the decade were explored in I Was a Teenage Werewolf, often read as a commentary on the fear of increasing juvenile delinquency. In the movie, a troubled and violent teenager, Tony, becomes a werewolf after a hypnotherapist injects him with an experimental serum. The movie was a massive success, particularly with young adult audiences, a new post-war economic power. This movie is arguably the first ever to cater specifically to the teen demographic, although certainly it would not be the last. In fact, since the 1950s, many narratives containing werewolf characters, from Teen Wolf to Ginger Snaps, Harry Potter to Twilight, have aimed for a teenage audience. In 1964, television saw its first small-screen and comedic werewolf in the character of Eddie Munster. Another popular horror comedy series, Dark Shadows, also included werewolves, further expanding the monster's influence as its small-screen representations engaged new audiences, and for the first time made werewolves funny. Werewolf films of the 1960s and 70s were dominated by narratives that depicted rising countercultures, the dismantling of the nuclear family, and even the corruption behind the Watergate scandal. Globally, werewolf films of the 70s took on changing sexual politics in parallel to the growing sexual revolution, with plots featuring promiscuous female victims and murderous prostitutes. The advancement of special effects and a growing appreciation for its artistry helped birth the violent transformation scenes that would become a hallmark of werewolf films in the 1980s. The audience's fascination with the grotesque change from human to werewolf also corresponds to growing stigmas around changes in the body that could occur with aging, fitness, and diet. 1980s werewolf films also took up ideas of class, showing that idealized suburbs were not the safe havens governments and popular media portrayed them to be. The 1981 film The Howling, loosely adapted from a 1977 book, depicts an entire resort full of werewolves.
It became inherently more terrifying in the idea that it wasn't just one werewolf / serial killer stalking protagonist Karen White. She finds herself in the lion's den, so to speak, of an entire werewolf colony. She's isolated and trapped, and those she loves most are also becoming werewolves around her. So that was a pretty big push forward into expanding, beyond one werewolf, you have werewolves.
The movie was groundbreaking for its use of special effects makeup, showing the full transformation from man to beast.
Rob Bottin's close-up transformation with the bladder effects, it just not only added a layer of creepiness and made this villain even just more intimidating, but there's something very painful about that too. It brings a physicality to the dual nature of being a werewolf. Special effects makes being afflicted with lycanthropy something harrowing and terrifying. It captures the body horror of what that means to become a werewolf in this very impressive way.
Also released in 1981, An American Werewolf in London borrows from European werewolf lore and references historical explanations for the monster. After being wounded by a werewolf, the main character David deteriorates mentally as the full moon waxes. The film alludes to a demonic cause behind the original werewolf transformation, a metaphorical inner beast, and even a vision David has of mutant Nazi werewolves, drawing supernatural Nazi werewolves into the horror movie genre for the first time. The werewolf's dramatic presence continued steadily into the 1990s. 18 movies with a myriad of werewolf characters were released during the decade, including a modern take on the werewolf lover myth. R.L. Stine's Goosebumps series alone included 8 werewolf stories between 1995 and 1999. Buffy the Vampire Slayer's lovable Oz fought alongside the Slayer, proactively caging himself during the full moon. The 1990s marked the popularity of the werewolf in another form of media, video games. While 1988's Altered Beast holds the title for the first video game with a werewolf character, games of the 90s fully embraced and embellished the monster. Hungry audiences demanded more, and werewolf popularity skyrocketed. ushering in a renaissance the monster hadn't seen in centuries. And the growing werewolf obsession really reached its pinnacle, with Alvin and the Chipmunks meet the Wolfman. Kidding. It's terrible. I'm really talking about the Canadian film Ginger Snaps. Released in 2000, Ginger Snaps both honors and transforms the previous 2 decades of werewolf cinema. The film explicitly portrays werewolfism as a sexually transferable condition and directly relates female puberty to monstrosity, both firsts for the monster. It's freaking awesome.
I think that a lot of the modern werewolf owes a debt to Ginger Snaps. That movie opened up the possibility of what werewolf's dual nature could mean. It's no longer just a man fighting off his inner beast or resisting his darker impulses or, trying to fight off a desire to kill. Now it can be a woman experiencing the changes that come with puberty. It could be an exploration of burgeoning sexuality. It could be an exploration of aging, mortality even.
The story, set in a seemingly idyllic suburb of Toronto, follows teen goth sisters Ginger and Brigitte. Ginger is bitten by a werewolf, triggering a transformation directly linked to her menstrual cycle. The film addresses teenage self-mutilation, suicidal thoughts, and violence at school. A plot point that came under scrutiny since its release followed the 1999 Columbine and W.R. Myers high school shootings. The movie also addresses mental illness in young adults, which came front and center in the 1990s as psychiatric drugs were increasingly prescribed to minors. The film's 2004 sequel would go on to address drug addiction through the werewolf's dependence on intravenous treatment to curb her transformation and violent desires. In 1999, J.K. Rowling used a Professor Lupin werewolf character as a metaphor for illnesses with social stigmas, like HIV. The werewolf also continued to reflect real-world anxiety when post-9/11 we saw an increase in narratives featuring military and werewolf conflicts, using werewolf lore to explore themes like PTSD, corrupt military officials, secret government weapons, and even the War on Terror. Long removed from real accusations of witchcraft and theological discourse, the 21st century produced more werewolf interpretations than ever seen before. Vampire-werewolf hybrids, Jughead as a werewolf, magical werewolf hides that contain eternal werewolf spirits, werewolf sims, packs of cartoon werewolf pups, aggressively muscular werewolves, the list goes on. It seems like werewolves haven't been this talked about since the werewolf trials.
In regard to Twilight, Stephenie Meyer does something that we have seen done time and time again, and that is the misappropriation of Native American culture, which is entwined with folklore about or beliefs in or narratives of werewolves to give them a certain authenticity. Although the way that Meyer uses this is very problematic, it's incredibly racist, it makes all sorts of assumptions, I think what it also does is it shows us something. Meyer did not invent this. It shows us something that has been occurring for a long time. This shows how settling cultures or colonizing cultures have absorbed, they have misappropriated, they have cannibalized indigenous beliefs in order to give a veneer of authenticity to new narratives.
On screen, Teen Wolf, True Blood, Vampire Diaries, Hemlock Grove, Van Helsing, and Penny Dreadful showed audiences attractive werewolves battling other supernatural creatures and coming to terms with their true nature. But not all modern werewolves inspire NSFW fanfiction. With so much history shadowing the werewolf, I wanted to know what creating a new story looks like today. So I asked Olivia Stephens, graphic novelist and comic writer, who just released a new YA werewolf graphic novel, Artie and the Wolf Moon.
I think it's important to start this off by saying that I am not a traditional werewolf fan. I'm more or less a blasphemous werewolf enthusiast, and a lot of my enthusiasm for werewolves isn't built from the werewolf media I've consumed, but built off of my interest in wolves as an animal. So for me, werewolves represent a deep relationship with nature, given the essential role that wolves play in their ecosystems. And so I see werewolves as an opportunity to kind of showcase achieving balance and reciprocity between humanity and nature. And I also see werewolves as sort of this vehicle for family and community building.
These werewolf stories demonstrate another modern werewolf trend, the werewolf pack. The pack is often portrayed as a tight-knit community, often at war with a rival pack or engaged in conflict with another supernatural species. The importance of the pack and of community for survival is present in real wolf populations, and human ones as well, providing ample material for supernatural metaphor.
And I structured the narrative so that while it is ultimately a story about werewolves and vampires, it also isn't. It's about a lot of things. These figures are so often used as symbols in storytelling to represent something else. So that tension between a clan of werewolves that are black due to their origins as escaped slaves, being under threat by a coven of largely white vampires who use hypnosis and other means to target vulnerable members of that community, and so distrust and paranoia within that community, that is a mirror to the real world of the story in a number of ways. So within this reading, vampirism is representative of white supremacy and white supremacy as a death cult. So it's an ideology whose members seek to, 1, destroy inter-community relationships, 2, to burden and drain the marginalized, and 3, to not even appear to place much value in their own lives, which is why they take so little stock in the lives of others, and refuse to acknowledge our interconnectedness as people.
In the last decade, we've seen plenty of comedic werewolves.
We don't smell our own crotches, we smell each other's.
Cartoon werewolves, and grotesque werewolves as well. We've seen more than 50 films and countless books and comics for audiences of all ages featuring werewolf characters. And there's no indication that the trend is slowing down. In fact, it's the opposite. But where will werewolves take us next?
I'm looking forward to tenderness. I'm excited for tender and sensitive werewolves, basically anything that spits in the face of the tortured, violent Wolfman losing control. As we become more aware about wolves, but also about our relationship with the natural world and what systems might be the real monsters in all of this, I just want to see how far we can collectively stretch this very intriguing concept before it just snaps.
I think Olivia is onto something. In the last 10 years, real-world reports of werewolf sightings have increased. Beginning in 2015, the British press ran stories about Old Stinker, the beast of Barmston Drain, a wolf with a human face and terrible breath who seemed to only terrorize women and the occasional dog. But this was not his first appearance. In the 1960s, he appeared nearby in Flixton as an ancient wolf-like creature walking upright with an unusually long tail he would knock people over with. This resurgence of werewolf sightings in Great Britain is particularly strange given the country's general lack of werewolf folklore. Since wolves have long been absent from England, how do we explain the recent sightings of the werewolf known as Old Stinker? Are pop culture and broader distribution of movies, literature, video games, and internet lore the inspiration behind this 21st century werewolf? Well, only partially. The place where Old Stinker has been spotted, an area called Hull, also happens to be the last reported habitat of wolves in England.
Using an eco-Gothic lens, we can perhaps offer other alternatives to what the werewolf can give us. What this hybrid monster can show us is that being both is not scary. It is a great opportunity for us to understand what humanity and what wolfdom means, and what these identities can offer. For a long time, wolves have been symbols of the ravaging and rapacious wilderness. And then more recently they've been reclaimed as pure and perfect symbols of this wilderness that must necessarily remain untouched by human hands. I think that werewolf gives us a place to think, not with these two extremes, good versus evil, but to think about how the truth of both our own existence as humans and those wolves' existence is that it's somewhere in between, and that we find ourselves living in a world that is not wilderness versus culture, but always somewhere muddling along between the two.
Real or fiction, good or evil, man or beast. Ultimately, werewolves are about dichotomies. They represent the thin boundaries between the human and inhuman, interior motives and outward appearance, animal and man, wild and civilized. As the perception of these contradictions changes over time, so too does the werewolf.
The best werewolf movie in the last 10 years, and luckily it has been a nice, exciting boon for werewolves in horror, But the best one might be 2017's Good Manners. Writer-directors Juliana Rojas and Marco Dutra, they use the werewolf mythology to explore loneliness and classism, of motherhood and the horrors of pregnancy, and all of it is just gels into this really grim fairy tale style narrative structure that's both scary and beautiful. And I think that that kind of speaks to what defines the modern werewolf, in that there really isn't any definition anymore other than the core of someone transforming into wolf or wolf creature.
I'm hopeful that in the future we're going to see more positive man into wolf transformations. The other thing I'd absolutely love to see is far more texts where werewolves live alongside vampires and fairies, and they live alongside sea monsters and zombies. For me, that reflects more truly what it is like living in an intersectional and diverse society, and a society where we can be connected with a pluralism via the internet, and that these monsters, these creatures that come from specific identities and cultures, have to learn how to live alongside each other, much like we are doing today.
We've come a long way from the first rumblings of the werewolf in ancient European cultures, and thankfully, just as far from the persecution of humans as werewolves. But what we haven't lost is the fear and the freedom in the human capacity for dramatic change. We'd like to thank Blinkist for supporting PBS. It can be hard to find the time to sit down and read a whole book, but now you can in the blink of an eye. Blinkist is an app that produces key takeaways from thousands of nonfiction books and condenses them into 15 minutes that you can either read or listen to. Blinkist has an array of categories to suit many interests, from society and culture to history and philosophy. For more information and a Blinkist limited trial, please go to the link in the description. Okay, my eyelash is kind of coming off, but you can't tell, right?
No.
Just the corner of this eye?
I don't know what you're saying.
Perfect.
I don't see anything. Okay.